They didn't just lose their son, they may have lost control of a secret that was buried for years, and now it's coming back to destroy everything. At first glance, this case looked painfully straightforward. A wealthy Hollywood family, a quiet neighborhood, two parents brutally murdered in their own home, and one obvious suspect, their adult son. The headlines moved fast, almost too fast, locking the story into place before anyone had time to breathe, let alone question it. Son accused of killing parents. Hollywood tragedy. Shocking family murder. The public absorbed the narrative in seconds because it fit a familiar box. Another disturbed adult child. Another violent outburst. Another tragic end. Case closed, or so it seemed. But simplicity is seductive. And in cases like this, it's often the first lie we tell ourselves. Because beneath that clean headline was a messier truth that almost no one paused to examine. This wasn't a story that began on the night of the murders. It didn't begin with flashing lights or police tape or a blood-soaked bedroom. It began years earlier, quietly, invisibly, inside systems designed to protect people who are unraveling and families who are desperately trying to hold them together. That context was missing from the early coverage. And once a narrative hardens, it becomes almost impossible to crack. What made this case feel simple wasn't the evidence. It was the framing. The public was shown an end point without a beginning, a result without a process, a catastrophe without a timeline. And when that happens, we stop asking the most important question of all: how did it get here? Early reporting focused almost exclusively on the violence itself, the brutality, the weapon, the unimaginable fact that two parents were killed by their own child. But stories like this don't exist in a vacuum. They are the final chapter of a much longer book, one filled with warning signs, failed interventions, uncomfortable compromises, and decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. Those chapters were largely ignored, not because they didn't exist, but because they complicated the story. And complication is the enemy of virality. This case mattered immediately, not just because of who the victims were, but because of what the case quietly exposed: the fragile line between personal responsibility and institutional failure, between mental illness and criminal culpability, between family loyalty and public accountability. Within the first days, those questions were already being buried under a louder, simpler moral judgment. Monster or victim? Guilty or insane? Evil or broken? Pick one. But reality doesn't work that way. As more details began to surface, cracks formed in the open and shut narrative. Not enough to change headlines, but enough to unsettle anyone paying close attention. Whispers of prior mental health struggles. Mentions of past interventions that never fully worked. Hints that this family had been fighting a private battle long before the public ever knew their names. These details didn't explode into the story. They leaked. Slowly. Inconsistently. Often buried in the middle of articles few people finished reading. And then there was the silence. Not the dramatic kind, but the institutional silence. The absence of clear answers about what safeguards had been attempted. The lack of explanation about why certain systems were activated and then quietly turned off. Silence about why warning signs didn't trigger long-term oversight. Silence about who made those calls and why. In high-profile cases, silence is rarely accidental. It's strategic, procedural, or protective. Sometimes all three. This wasn't just about a family tragedy anymore. It was about whether the structures meant to prevent exactly this kind of outcome had failed or had been intentionally stepped away from. And that distinction matters more than people realize. Because if the case is simple, then it's an anomaly, a horror story with no broader lesson. But if it's complex, then it forces a reckoning. With mental health law, with conservatorship, with how wealth, influence, and fear intersect behind closed doors. The reason this story matters and mattered within the first 20 seconds is because it challenges a comforting belief that extreme violence always arrives without warning. That there is always a clear villain and a clean explanation. That systems work the way they're supposed to when families ask for help. This case quietly suggests the opposite. That warning signs can be documented, acknowledged, and still left unresolved. That intervention can happen and then be undone. That the most dangerous moments often arrive not during chaos, but after prolonged denial. And here's the part few people noticed at the time: the early narrative didn't just simplify the crime. It simplified the responsibility. By focusing only on the act, it avoided the uncomfortable question of whether this outcome was preventable, and if so, by whom. That question threatens more than one reputation. It threatens institutions, legal frameworks, even cultural assumptions about autonomy, control, and when it's acceptable to intervene in someone's life. This is why the story refused to stay contained. Because once you start pulling at the thread, once you look beyond the night of the murders, the case stops being about one person's actions and starts becoming about a chain of decisions made over years. Decisions that seemed survivable individually, but catastrophic collectively. And the most dangerous illusion of all was believing this story was finished the moment the suspect was arrested. It wasn't finished. It was just finally visible. And the next part of the story, the part almost no one wanted to talk about, forces us to go backward. To 2020. To a legal mechanism most people misunderstand. And to a decision that, in hindsight, may be one of the most consequential moments in this entire tragedy. That's where things stop being simple. To understand why this case unraveled the way it did, you have to rewind not to the night of the murders, but to a moment years earlier that was never meant to become public conversation. Because long before police reports and court hearings, there was a legal intervention quietly put into place. And just as quietly, it was taken away. In 2020, Nick Reiner was placed under a mental health conservatorship. Not the celebrity-style financial arrangement the public tends to recognize, but something far more serious, far more invasive, and far more telling. This was an LPS conservatorship rooted in a California law from 1967 designed specifically for individuals deemed unable to care for themselves due to grave mental disorder. It is not cosmetic. It is not symbolic. It is the legal system's acknowledgement that a person may be a danger to themselves or others, and that ordinary autonomy has to temporarily give way to protection. That fact alone should have stopped the story in its tracks. Because conservatorship like this don't happen casually. They require medical evaluations, judicial approval, professional oversight, a finding that the situation has crossed a threshold most families fight desperately to avoid. No parent wakes up one morning eager to strip their child of independence. They do it when everything else has failed, when the risk of doing nothing feels greater than the pain of intervening. And yet, when the murders occurred, this conservatorship was barely mentioned, if at all. It was treated as a footnote, a curiosity, something in the past. But in cases involving mental health, the past is rarely past. It's precedent, it's pattern, it's warning. What makes this conservatorship especially unsettling isn't just that it existed, it's that it ended. Under the law, LPS conservatorship can be renewed, extended, maintained if the underlying risks remain. They don't expire automatically like a parking meter. They end because someone decides the conditions no longer justify control. And in this case, the conservatorship lasted only 1 year. 1 year. That decision raises a question so uncomfortable, it almost disappears under the noise of the crime itself. What changed? Was there a documented recovery? A sustained period of stability? Or was the conservatorship simply becoming too volatile, too contentious, too emotionally explosive to maintain? Because reporting later revealed something critical: Nick Reiner hated being under conservatorship. Not in a passive, resentful way. In an explosive way. He reportedly viewed it as humiliating. Beneath him, a direct assault on his ego. Even discussions about reinstating it were said to trigger rage. That reaction matters. Not because it proves guilt or innocence, but because it reveals how fragile the balance really was. A conservatorship is supposed to create stability. But when the person under it reacts with escalating hostility, families face a brutal dilemma. Enforce it and risk constant conflict, or loosen control and hope autonomy doesn't turn dangerous. That's not a legal question. It's a human one. And it's where many families, even wealthy, well-connected ones, break. This is where the story gets quieter and darker. Because once the conservatorship ended, the safety net didn't get replaced. It didn't transform into a long-term alternative structure. It simply vanished. The legal system stepped back. The authority dissolved. Responsibility returned to the individual, even though the conditions that triggered intervention in the first place hadn't magically disappeared. And this is the part people don't like to confront. Ending a conservatorship doesn't mean the problem is solved. It often means the problem has become harder to control. Friends would later describe patterns that sound haunting in retrospect. Financial recklessness, explosive reactions to boundaries, a relentless need for control paired with an inability to manage it. The very behaviors conservatorship exists to contain. Yet instead of escalating oversight, the system retreated. Why? Some believe the answer lies in money. Not wealth, but access. Conservatorship restricts spending. They limit impulsive decisions. They cut off easy pathways to destructive behavior. Removing that restriction restores freedom and risk. Others believe the answer lies in exhaustion. The emotional burnout of trying to save someone who resents being saved. Still others point to a deeper fear that pushing too hard could permanently sever the relationship. Whatever the reason, the outcome was the same. The guardrails came down. And Hayraced the crucial point most coverage missed once the conservatorship ended. The responsibility didn't disappear, it shifted. From courts and clinicians back to family members. People who are not trained to manage psychosis, addiction, or violent instability. People who are emotionally invested. Who hope tomorrow will be better. Who convince themselves this phase will pass. This is why the conservatorship matters. Not as an excuse. Not as a defense. But as a signal the system recognized danger and then walked away from it. And if that's true, then the night of the murders wasn't an unpredictable explosion. It was a collapse that followed years of strain, compromise, and unresolved risk. A moment where all the safety mechanisms had already been dismantled. Which leads to the next contradiction. Because if the system once believed intervention was necessary, why are we now being told the man at the center of this case doesn't even understand where he is? That question takes us inside the jail, and into a performance that may be far more calculated than it appears. By the time the case reached its next phase, the narrative shifted again, this time in a way that felt almost deliberately confusing. Reports began circulating that Nick Reiner was no longer just unstable, but profoundly disconnected from reality. Delirious. Childlike. Unable to process where he was or what he had done. According to certain outlets, he wasn't simply awaiting trial, he was barely present at all. A man lost inside his own mind. On the surface, it sounded like confirmation of what many expected, that this was never a criminal case, but a mental health tragedy. That whatever happened in that house was the product of psychosis, not intent. But when stories change this dramatically, especially in high-profile cases, the most important question becomes not whether the claims are true, but who benefits from them. Because there was a problem with this version of events. It didn't match what people inside the courtroom were seeing. Observers who had a direct view of Nick Reiner described someone very different from the person being portrayed in headlines. He wasn't slumped, sedated, or unaware. He tracked the proceedings. He responded appropriately when addressed by the judge. He acknowledged instructions. He nodded when attorneys spoke to him. These aren't the behaviors of someone completely untethered from reality. They are small details, but in legal settings, small details are everything. And then there was the timing. The claims of delirium emerged after key strategic shifts in the case. After the exit of high-powered private counsel. After the introduction of a public defender. After the defense options narrowed. That doesn't prove manipulation, but it does raise the possibility of positioning. Because in criminal law, perception can be as powerful as evidence. How a defendant appears matters. How they are described matters. And once a narrative of incapacity takes hold, it becomes difficult to dislodge. This is where the meth theory enters the story, not as a shock, but as a confirmation. Long before the latest reporting, addiction specialists had raised alarms about the nature of the crime itself. The violence, the weapon choice, the intensity. These aren't random details. Methamphetamine is known to induce extreme paranoia, psychosis, and dissociative states. People in meth-induced psychosis can commit acts they later claim not to remember, and in many cases, that claim is genuine. Memory loss doesn't always equal deception. But Hayraced the nuance that gets lost. Meth psychosis is often temporary. Once the drug leaves the system, cognition typically returns. Sometimes slowly, sometimes unevenly, but it returns, which makes the continued portrayal of total mental disintegration weeks later difficult to reconcile, especially when courtroom behavior suggests awareness. That contradiction doesn't mean mental illness isn't real. It means it may be selective, situational, or strategically emphasized. A retired FBI agent who attended court proceedings described someone alert enough to understand who was speaking, when to respond, and how to comport himself. Not animated, not emotional, but present. The only truly aberrant moment? A sudden, intense scan of the courtroom as if searching for someone who wasn't there. Family, witnesses, support. When he didn't find them, the moment passed. That absence matters more than it appears. Because isolation changes behavior. A man who once relied on parents, attorneys, and resources suddenly found himself alone. No elite legal shield. No visible family support. No financial safety net. For the first time, the gravity of his situation may have fully landed. And that realization doesn't always produce clarity, it produces collapse. But collapse is not the same as incapacity. This distinction is critical because the legal system treats them very differently. Incompetence requires inability to understand proceedings or assist in one's own defense. Despair, confusion, and emotional regression do not. And courts are exceptionally cautious about mistaking one for the other. Which brings us back to the idea of theater not in the sense of performance as deception, but as adaptation. People under extreme legal threat often regress. They withdraw. They simplify their behavior. Some become silent. Others become childlike. Not because they are incapable, but because that posture feels safer, less accountable, less overwhelming. That doesn't mean Nick Reiner is faking everything. It means the public is being shown a curated version of his condition filtered through sources with something at stake. And then there's the most uncomfortable question of all. If he truly does not understand where he is, how did he understand enough to respond to a judge? To track conversations? To adjust behavior depending on who was speaking to him? Those inconsistencies don't disappear just because a headline declares them irrelevant. What we are witnessing may not be a lie, but it isn't the full truth either. And as the image of a broken, disconnected defendant solidified in the public imagination, something else quietly slipped out of view: accountability. Not just his, but the system's. Because if the narrative becomes he was never really there, then no one has to answer why warning signs were missed, why interventions ended, why oversight failed. The truth likely sits somewhere in the middle. A man with real mental illness, a history of substance abuse, periods of clarity, periods of collapse, and a legal strategy navigating those fluctuations with precision, which leads to the next turning point in this story. Because just as the portrayal of Nick Reiner shifted, the money disappeared. And when the money disappeared, so did the defense that was supposed to save him. There is a moment in every high-profile criminal case when the truth stops being abstract and becomes painfully transactional. Not philosophical, not emotional, but financial. And in this case, that moment arrived quietly without a press conference, without an explanation, when one of the most powerful defense attorneys in the country suddenly stepped away. Alan Jackson was gone. No dramatic farewell, no legal fireworks. Just a brief statement in court, delivered with the kind of practiced restraint that only comes from years of navigating collapses behind closed doors. The reason was never officially stated. But in the legal world, silence is rarely mysterious. It's procedural, and this silence spoke volumes. Because when elite defense attorneys exit mid-case, there are only a few explanations. Conflict of interest, ethical breach, or money. And this time, all signs pointed in one direction. The family did not replace Jackson with another private attorney. They didn't shop for a new high-powered name. They didn't scramble to preserve the appearance of an aggressive defense. Instead, Nick Reiner was assigned a public defender. That single shift reframed everything. Public defenders are not inferior attorneys, but they are not chosen. They are assigned when resources run out or support disappears. And in a case this complex, this public, this legally delicate, the move signaled something far more significant than a change in strategy. It signaled abandonment. Behind the scenes, whispers began to circulate about the cost of Jackson's defense. Numbers so high they were almost unbelievable. Millions of dollars. Some sources suggested as much as $4 million had already been paid. Whether that figure is exact almost doesn't matter. What matters is the implication: the financial runway was gone. And when the runway disappears, so does leverage. For months, Jackson's team had been working relentlessly, filing motions, shaping narratives, preparing for an insanity defense that would require enormous resources, expert witnesses, psychiatric evaluations, forensic analysis, endless preparation. This is not a defense you run on a budget. It is a strategy that burns cash at a breathtaking pace. So when the money stopped, the strategy stopped with it. This is where the case takes its most unsettling turn. Because money isn't just about legal fees. It's about emotional investment. It's about belief. Families don't spend millions defending someone unless they truly believe that person can be saved. That belief appears to have cracked. Whether it was exhaustion, grief, or exposure to evidence the public hasn't seen, something changed. The siblings, now the only surviving family, did not step in to preserve the defense. They didn't publicly advocate. They didn't intervene. They pulled back. And that withdrawal may be the most telling development of all. Because families know things the public doesn't. They see photos we never will. They hear details that never make it into court filings. They sit with truths that cannot be rationalized away. And when family support collapses, it is rarely impulsive. It is cumulative. The implications are brutal. Without Jackson, the defense loses continuity, momentum, institutional memory, the ability to control narrative. Public defenders inherit cases midstream, often without the luxury of reshaping them from the ground up. And in this case, that means the window for a carefully constructed insanity defense may already be closing. Even more damning is what this shift communicates to a jury, whether consciously or not. Jurors notice when families disengage. They notice when financial backing evaporates. They notice when a defendant sits alone. These are human judgments, not legal ones, but they influence outcomes all the same. And for Nick Reiner, isolation has become the defining feature of this phase. No parents, no elite counsel, no visible family presence. Just a man facing the consequences of actions that can no longer be buffered by influence or wealth. For the first time in his life, the structures that absorbed his volatility are gone. This is why the Delirious defendant narrative gained traction when it did. Not earlier, not at arrest, but after the defense collapsed, after resources dried up, after the realization set in that this case may not be winnable in the way it once seemed. Because when strategy fails, desperation follows. And desperation doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like withdrawal, like regression, like becoming smaller, quieter, less accountable. A posture that invites pity rather than scrutiny, that shifts the focus from evidence to condition. But no amount of reframing can undo what has already happened. The violence, the warnings, the decisions made and unmade along the way. Which leaves us with the most haunting realization of all. This case didn't fall apart because of one bad night. It fell apart because every safeguard failed one by one until there was nothing left to hold it together. And once that truth sinks in, the story stops being about guilt or innocence. It becomes about something much harder to accept, that this outcome may have been preventable. By the time all the noise fades, the headlines, the speculation, the courtroom drama, what remains is an uncomfortable truth that refuses to be simplified. This was never just a single act of violence, and it was never just about one man losing control. It was the end result of a long chain of decisions, hesitations, and institutional retreats that stretched across years. A tragedy built not in an instant, but slowly, quietly, in moments when intervention was possible and then abandoned. The most unsettling part of this story is not the brutality of the crime itself, but how many systems touched this case and then stepped away. Mental health courts recognized the danger. A conservatorship was imposed. Professionals were empowered to intervene. And yet, when resistance grew, when the process became difficult, the safeguards dissolved. Responsibility shifted back to a family already stretched thin, emotionally exhausted, and likely hoping against evidence that things would somehow stabilize on their own. That hope is something many families recognize. It's human, it's understandable, and it's often fatal. As the legal process now grinds forward, the focus will inevitably narrow. Competency hearings, motions, expert testimony, labels. But none of those can fully capture what this case represents. Because regardless of the verdict, the broader failure has already occurred. A system designed to prevent exactly this outcome identified the risk and then lost the will or capacity to contain it. The shifting portrayals of Nick Reiner monster, victim, addict, psychotic, manipulator, lost child are not contradictions. They are fragments. And fragments never tell the full story on their own. What we are watching now is not just a trial, but a reckoning with how society manages severe mental illness when money, autonomy, and fear collide. When intervention feels cruel. When letting go feels easier. When accountability becomes negotiable. There are questions that may never be answered publicly. Why the conservatorship wasn't extended? What evidence finally broke the family's resolve? What conversations happened behind closed doors in the months before the murders? Those answers matter not to assign blame retroactively, but to prevent the next quiet collapse from becoming another headline. Because this case is not an anomaly. It is a warning. A warning that danger doesn't always arrive suddenly. A warning that systems don't fail loudly, they erode. And a warning that once every safety net is gone, the fall is absolute. What happens next in court will decide legal guilt. But the deeper verdict on prevention, responsibility, and systemic failure has already been delivered. And it leaves us with one final, unresolved question: how many more families are standing on this same edge, unseen? Subscribe for continued in-depth analysis and updates.